In October of 1962, the same week the world spent staring at grainy photographs of missile sites in Cuba, a much smaller and far stranger crisis was unfolding 6,000 miles away, at a nuclear missile installation in rural Montana. It did not make the news. It has never fully made the news. But a single file, stamped and reclassified 4 separate times between 1962 and 1997, describes an incident that the Air Force officially attributes to equipment malfunction, and that at least 3 men who were present that night insisted, until the day they died, was nothing of the kind. This is the story of that file, the men who wrote it, and the 63 years the government has spent trying to make sure no one asked the right questions about it. The document itself is 14 pages long. It carries the designation of an Internal Security Incident Report filed under a Missile Wing's Counterintelligence Division, and it was not declassified through any official disclosure process. It surfaced instead through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1994 by a retired Air Force historian who was researching an entirely unrelated topic, the reliability of early Minuteman guidance systems. He requested a broad range of maintenance logs from that base for that period. What he received, apparently by administrative error, included this report tucked inside a folder of unrelated documents. He recognized immediately that it did not belong there, and he recognized just as quickly that if he returned it, it would disappear. He kept it. He did not publish it for another 11 years, out of what he later described as simple fear, and when he finally did release it, in 2005, it generated almost no attention at all, buried as it was under a wave of far louder, far less credible claims circulating in the same community at the time. I believe that obscurity is precisely what has allowed this document to remain one of the most quietly compelling pieces of evidence in this entire subject, because nobody built a career on it, nobody monetized it. It simply sat, mostly ignored, for 2 decades. The report begins, as these things so often do, with something mundane. At 11:42 p.m. on the night in question, 2 missile combat crew members on duty in an underground launch control capsule reported what they described as a sustained interruption in communications with several of the missile silos under their command. This part of the story is not disputed. It is corroborated by maintenance logs, by a separate incident report filed the following morning by the squadron's communications officer, and by testimony given decades later by one of the 2 crew members, a launch officer whose name appears in the file only as Captain R. Voss. The interruption lasted, according to the log, approximately 7 minutes. During those 7 minutes, the file states, guidance and targeting systems across multiple missile silos exhibited simultaneous and unexplained faults consistent with either a coordinated jamming event or an electromagnetic anomaly of unknown origin. That sentence alone, if it stood on its own, would be a curious but unremarkable footnote in the long history of Cold War equipment glitches. It is what happens next in the file that turns this into something else entirely. While the communications outage was underway, a 2-man security patrol assigned to perimeter checks at one of the affected missile sites radioed in an unscheduled report. Their transmission, partially transcribed in the file from an audio recording that the document states was later lost during routine records disposal, describes the 2 airmen observing what they called a large luminous object hovering directly above the missile site's above-ground support structure, at what they estimated to be a height of less than 200 feet. The transcription includes the following exchange, verbatim, as it appears in the declassified pages. One airman says, "It's not moving, it's just sitting there." The other responds, "Get on the horn, tell them the fence line lights are out, tell them anything, just get someone else out here." A pause follows in the transcript, marked only as inaudible, approximately 40 seconds. Then the first airman's voice returns, and he says something that the report's author felt necessary to flag with a handwritten annotation in the margin, visible in the declassified scan. "It's not a light, there's something inside it moving." The transcript ends there. The file states that security personnel dispatched to relieve the 2 airmen arrived approximately 11 minutes later and found both men alert, oriented, and physically uninjured, but that one of them, identified only by the initials DM, was, in the words of the responding sergeant's own follow-up statement, unable to account for a period of time he insisted had passed, despite his watch and our own timepieces indicating otherwise. This is the detail that pulls this file out of the realm of ordinary equipment malfunction paperwork and into something considerably stranger. DM reported that he believed only a few minutes had elapsed between the object's appearance and the arrival of the relief team. The relief team's own log places that gap at closer to 25 minutes. Nobody in the file offers an explanation for the discrepancy. Nobody seems to have tried very hard to find one, at least not on paper. What happened over the following 72 hours is, to me, the more disturbing part of this story, more disturbing in some ways than the sighting itself, because it shows so clearly how a system designed to protect national security can also, almost incidentally, protect itself from ever having to explain something it doesn't understand. Both airmen were separated and interviewed individually the following day, not by their own unit's intelligence officer, but by two men who arrived from outside the base, whose names do not appear anywhere in the declassified file, and whose affiliation is redacted in every single instance where the document attempts to identify them. The file refers to them only as visiting security liaison personnel. Captain Voss, in an interview conducted in 2003 by an independent researcher, an interview whose audio I have listened to in full, stated flatly that he did not recognize the insignia either man wore, that neither wore a name tape, and that when he asked his own squadron commander who they were, he was told, in Voss's words, "That's not something you need to worry about, Captain." Both airmen who witnessed the object were reassigned within 30 days to bases in different states, a personnel movement that the file attributes to routine rotational staffing needs. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I've now read a great deal of Cold War-era personnel documentation, and routine rotational staffing needs do not typically result in two men who work the same 8-hour shift on the same night at the same 20-person installation being sent to opposite ends of the country within a single month of each other, especially not in an era when reassignments of that kind required weeks of paperwork and were rarely executed with this kind of speed. DM, the airman who reported the missing time, was the one reassigned first, moved within 9 days to a base in Alaska. His military records, insofar as they've been located by researchers over the years, show no further disciplinary or medical entries of note. He completed his enlistment without incident and, as far as anyone has been able to determine, never spoke publicly about the events of that night. He died in 2011. No family members who have been contacted report ever hearing him discuss it. Captain Voss did speak, eventually, though only once, and only decades later, and only, by his own account, because he had recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness and had, in his words, stopped caring what anyone thought. In that 2003 interview, he describes being told directly by one of the unidentified visiting personnel that the incident would be officially attributed to a combination of a power grid fluctuation and what he called a probable weather balloon or aircraft misidentification by inexperienced personnel. Voss states that he pointed out, at the time, that the security patrol's own communications equipment had also malfunctioned during the exact same window as the missile guidance systems, and that weather balloons do not typically interfere with radio hardware. He says he was told, and I'm quoting the recording directly here, "You're a launch officer, Captain, not an investigator. Your job is to launch missiles, not explain them." He describes that sentence as the moment he understood that whatever had happened that night, the report being filed about it was never going to reflect what he and his men had actually witnessed. I want to be careful here, because I think it's important, when examining a case like this, to hold two things in your mind simultaneously without collapsing them into each other. The first is that Cold War-era nuclear missile facilities experienced a genuinely enormous number of equipment malfunctions, false alarms, and communications failures throughout the 1960s, many of them now well documented and mundane in origin: faulty wiring, extreme cold weather affecting underground cabling, and in at least one now famous 1966 case at a different Montana missile wing, a security violation alarm that was later traced to a squirrel. The temptation in a story like this is to assume every strange military document from this era must point towards something extraordinary, and that temptation should be resisted. Most of them don't. The second thing to hold in your mind, though, is that this particular file does not read like routine malfunction paperwork. Routine malfunction paperwork does not require unidentified personnel from outside the chain of command to conduct interviews. It does not typically result in the rapid reassignment of witnesses to separate installations, and it does not usually contain a handwritten margin annotation from its own author, flagging a specific line of witness testimony as worth independent follow-up, a follow-up that, as far as any available record shows, was never actually conducted, or if it was, its results were never attached to this file. There is one more piece of this story that I think deserves attention, because it is the piece that convinced me this was worth investigating seriously rather than filing away as one more ambiguous Cold War anomaly. In 1997, during a broader records review connected to declassification efforts following the end of the Cold War, this file was flagged for re-review by an archivist working within the Air Force's own Historical Records Office. Her notes, which are attached to the file's cover sheet, recommend the document for continued classification, citing what she describes only as ongoing sensitivity regarding the nature of the reported anomaly and its potential relevance to unresolved incidents at other strategic missile installations. That phrase, unresolved incidents at other strategic missile installations, plural, is doing an enormous amount of work in a single sentence, and it is the only place in any version of this file where an official, on the record, in writing, acknowledges that this Montana incident might not have been isolated. She does not elaborate. The file does not include any list of these other incidents. Whatever she was referring to, if it exists in writing anywhere else, has not surfaced. I've spent a long time trying to determine whether other missile installations from that same window, in October of 1962, reported anything unusual, given how much attention that particular week has received for entirely different, entirely terrestrial reasons. The Cuban Missile Crisis dominates the historical record of that period so completely that almost nothing else from those 13 days has received serious independent scrutiny. Researchers who have looked into declassified Strategic Air Command communications from that week have noted in passing references to at least 2 other unrelated equipment anomaly reports at missile facilities in North Dakota and Wyoming, filed within 72 hours of the Montana incident, both of which remain, as of this recording, either fully classified or so heavily redacted that their content cannot be meaningfully assessed. Whether these are connected to what happened in Montana, or whether they're simply the ordinary background noise of a nuclear arsenal running at maximum alert during the most dangerous week of the entire Cold War, I genuinely cannot tell you. I don't think anyone currently can, and I am suspicious, deeply suspicious, of anyone in this space who claims otherwise with total confidence. What I keep returning to, when I think about this case, is not the object itself, whatever it was, hovering silently over a nuclear missile site during the single tensest week in the history of the atomic age. What I keep returning to is Captain Voss's voice on that recording, an old man near the end of his life, describing being told that his job was to launch missiles, not explain them. There is something quietly chilling in that instruction, something that extends far beyond this one file, this one base, this one October night. It suggests an institutional posture, deliberate or otherwise, in which the men closest to the most consequential and dangerous technology ever built were explicitly discouraged from asking what else might be operating in the same airspace, watching the same silos, present at the exact moment humanity came closer to nuclear war than it ever had before or has since. Was that proximity a coincidence? I don't know. Nobody who was actually there and willing to talk about it ever seemed to think so, and every documented attempt to investigate further seems to have been quietly closed before it could produce an answer either way. Whatever hovered over that missile field for 7 minutes in October of 1962, it left behind a communications blackout, 2 reassigned airmen, a captain who carried the memory of that night in silence for 40 years, and a single line in a 1997 archivist's note admitting, almost in passing, that Montana was not the only place it happened. 63 years later, that admission is still the closest thing to an official answer anyone has ever gotten.